Hello, everyone. This is Linda Westphal from the Software Excellence Academy. The sponsor of our webinar series is the ASQ Software Division. I'm really pleased to welcome back Tom Gilb as our presenter today. He's going to be talking about EVO, sidestepping conventional IT testing.
Okay, welcome everybody. What I wanted to do was to tell you about a lot of fairly advanced ways of getting better quality in your IT systems, and many of them don't seem to be widely taught or widely known. And so it's about time we spread the word that there are some better methods out there if you need them. You'll notice the QR for the slides, and I'll have one at the end as we take questions and things like that. And I'm sure Linda will help publicize the link. I also put it on LinkedIn and X yesterday. So step one, just our baseline is what I call conventional testing. Of course, there are an awful lot of different variations there. I found a nice list called 9 types of API testing, which covers pretty much what we're not talking about and what we're going to try and go further with. But it's about, if you like, bug hunting is the simple word. There's my old friend Grace Murray Hopper, who I had the privilege many times of meeting at conferences and taking to lunch in Oslo and things like that, and her famous moth, the world's first real bug. First, the concept, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but I wanted to have a more formal definition of it, the notion of upstream. And so I mean upstream of writing code and executing code and testing code. So that covers everything to do with requirements and design and test design and construction. And that's where I'm going to be working, suggesting that we can do some of what we call testing today, checking out the system and looking for problems, by better, cheaper, faster, and more thoroughly by going upstream. In other words, not testing the code itself, but testing everything that happens before. Here's an example from one of my favorite clients, Intel, and favorite guys, John Terzakis, who used my planning language methods for specification. We'll see plenty of examples of that later in the talk. And he also used my variation of the IBM inspection called specification quality control, spec QC, if you like. And he took the time and trouble to do a lot of research and publish it. So I've got some facts and figures of how good these methods are. The particular table we're looking at, a group of engineers at Intel deliver 31 pages of requirements, and they specified in my planning language, and they find 312 defects, which means about 10 defects per page. A page is 600 words, by the way. Now, that is actually 10 times better than most people's requirements. If you just get raw requirements, we expect 100, and out of all you need is 100 ambiguous words and 600 words, and that really isn't too difficult. Anyway, at Intel, they have figured out that if they allow this quantity of defects and requirements to go on to design and the logic of a chip, they're going to have a lot of chips that they have to recall all over the world, and it's going to bankrupt Intel. They know from their serious engineering studies that they have to get 50 times better, right? No more than 0.2 per page, or 1 defect per 5 times 600 words, 3,000 words. That's pretty good. And so what they do is they say, you have such a high density of defects in your requirements, you are not allowed to exit, meaning we're not going to send this on to anybody else. It's not good enough. And so the engineers go back and try to figure out what they did wrong, and they actually get twice as good second time around, and third time around, not much more. Fourth time around, not much more, but they're beginning to understand how to write requirements properly according to the official standardized rules, which are as simple as extremely clear and unambiguous and things like that. Anyway, after a while, and this is actually weeks and months sometimes go by here, they get down to 0.22, and John says, you can exit. We will happily send your requirements on to the next stage. So yeah, so they're in a sense, they're getting 10 times better just because they're using a clear language for requirements called language. And then they get another 50 times better, not by finding and removing defects. These defects are based on a sample. You don't even find all the defects that you could find there. It's too arduous. But they actually go back and learn how to write requirements clearly. And they keep on getting better until they're 50 times better. And hopefully they retain that knowledge for their next requirements project. So in other words, the logic hasn't been written. The chip hasn't been made yet. And they're finding horrendous quantities of things that are going to cause bugs in the logic of their chip. But they're dealing with it upstream. They're dealing with it at requirements time. And this is before they're doing the chip design itself, the logic design. And they're partly getting good, like I reckon 10 times better, by having an extremely clear language for requirements where they quantify all their qualities. And partly they're getting good by learning to follow some pretty elementary rules, like write it so clearly that your colleagues can understand exactly what you want. Okay, and then here's some data about the results. For example, they deliver 2 or 3 times as much in total productivity. Okay, here's another view of the same thing. Here are some we call specification rules, and they're the official rules. These are published in my book, Competitive Engineering, free copy here. If you see anything in square brackets, it means at the back of the slides, there's some references, and in the references, there's a free download URL. So you get a free copy of the book. In the book, we've published some rules. Here's an example. And here, it doesn't just say it should be clear. It's just specification should be clear enough to test and unambiguous to their intended readers. So there's a whole lot of, that one sentence has several qualifications. What does it mean to be clear? But if you aren't that clear, that's a defect. Okay, if you violate any of these 20 or so rules, you have a defect, and at Intel, they don't like this stuff. So in other words, the big battle regarding bugs is not programmers writing bad logic. It's actually people planning things ahead who are vague. They're maybe writing user stories and think those are clear. They never are. That kind of problem. Here's another example from my work at McDonnell Douglas and later Boeing, where really exactly the same thing is happening, except we're using aircraft engineering drawings. And Gary, who's a real engineer we got a sample from, he had 80 defects in his engineering drawing. You don't want those 80 defects to get into the airplane, of course. So close to zero defects is what they're looking for. But and Gary was a very experienced engineer and quite shocked that they were finding 80 major defects found in his drawing. By the way, that implies that something like a couple hundred exist, of which we found a fraction, 80. So, just fixing all the 80 really isn't going to help. It's all the ones you didn't fix that statistically are there. That's the problem. So basically I said to Gary, just like at Intel, no exit, Gary. And Gary tried again. And just like at Intel, he got twice as good, but not good enough, nowhere near. And he tried again and again. It's actually the same pattern as we saw in the chips. And finally, he got down to zero. There's a background joke here we know about. They tried to say that his ink wasn't dark enough. It was a defect. And he pointed out there was no standard for how dark the ink is, so he got off scot-free with that so-called defect. So what is quality assurance? I was reading some stuff on the internet last night about quality assurance, and basically they were using that term instead of testing. And I was not amused. Quality assurance is, if you say testing is quality control, I'm okay with that. But quality assurance, that's all this upstream stuff and preventative stuff. And it's a heck of a lot more than testing. So somebody's using a fancy term, quality assurance, on what they, if they were a little bit more humble, they just call testing. Now, here's a statement I've always believed in. You cannot get good industrial, large-scale system qualities like security and usability by removing bugs, okay? You have to design those qualities into the system. And I know a lot of IT people have very poor training and education in both requirements and design. And they don't even know how poor their training is. I hope to wake some of them up or help you wake them up. Now, last week I came across a book I didn't even know existed. My old friend who I've met once, Joseph Duran, one of the quality gurus with Dr. Deming, he wrote a book called Quality by Design. And it's a great book. And he makes the argument, the same argument here, that every engineer knows, but IT people don't seem to know very well, that you do not get the qualities you want by removing bugs. Okay, you get a quality called less buggy, but you don't get security and you don't get usability and 10 other critical qualities. Now, the other thing about quality assurance is you don't do it at the level of the code. I found people are incredibly narrow-minded regarding, code is everything. You have to look at the entire system of people, databases, hardware, internet, cloud, laws, side effects, other qualities. And that's the system which the code lives in. And a lot of your problems with qualities will be things you have to do with the other stuff, not the code, like motivating people, training people, getting an internet connection that actually works, and a few things like that. Okay, so here I'm bragging a little bit about Duran's nice book, all the good thing he did there. We found that there are on certain internet sites, there are free PDF copies of this book from 1992 if you want to get a hold of it. But here's from the book a series of setting quality goals and ending up with better quality systems. Here's some more from the book. He is a great lover, like I am, of tables for expressing multiple requirements and multiple designs and their interaction. So here they are from 1992. Pretty good. I'd like to think I was doing better earlier than that, but I'm very happy that he understands that you have to represent things with tables to really understand multiple qualities and multiple designs for quality. Some of you will know, certainly know of Ben Franklin. This picture of him painted long after he died isn't the best picture I've seen, but it's one with the fireman's cap, because he brought firefighting to Philadelphia. But I always remember his old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So that's from 1735, published in Poor Richard's Almanac, etc. And I want to talk a little bit about preventing defects from happening rather than just finding them early, finding them early in requirements and finding them early in design. And defect prevention is anything you do which prevents the defect from getting in there at all. Okay, and in a sense, a defect prevented is great, because you never have to detect it and you can never fail to detect it because it ain't there. So that's really good stuff. And it turns out there's some really good stuff about defect prevention, which I'll tell you about in a moment. Take a little break for some poetry from a Danish scientist who did short grooks, he called them, on the side. And I know these from the old days. The road to wisdom is plain and simple to express, to err and err again, but less and less and less. Oh, I like that. That's about learning to prevent defects from getting into your IT system. And I found another corresponding one, and these are drawings done by Piet Hein himself. This is him on the back of a Norwegian aircraft. Wisdom is the booby prize given when you've been unwise. Well, something good no matter what bad stuff happens. We just need to learn from it. Here's a very famous learning cycle, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, the plan, do, study, act cycle, which Deming calls the Short cycle from his teacher, and most people call it a Deming or Deming-Short cycle or PDSA cycle. And I used to take Deming to the opera and ballet in London in the old days as a hobby to get to know him better. That was a lot of fun. We both like dance and culture. But I asked for permission to use his plan, do, check, act cycle. And he said, Tom, I changed my mind. I want to go back to what I learned from Walter Short with study instead. These are the original letters. Here's a very basic idea that we're going to talk about. And that is the people who can best improve your systems that are injecting defects are the grassroots people. So here are some grassroots people. And the reason is because they are near to the action. They know what silly things their boss said to them that caused them to create errors. Like, you have to work until you're so tired you fall asleep or something like that. So the best, what we're going to learn is one of the most successful ways of preventing errors is not letting outside consultants or managers decide what to do, but letting the grassroots do it. Okay, so we'll get to that in a moment. Now, how do we delegate power to the people? And one is, make them directly responsible for quantified critical requirements. Say that's, we're going to measure this, and if it gets better, that's your honor, and if it gets worse, well, do something about it. Give them the freedom to decide how to design their working environment so that, not the consultants, not the outside experts on a specialty, not the managers, let the workers design their own environment, okay? And let them take responsibility for measuring whether that gives better results or not. We'll see how that works in practice in a moment. Get the unprofessional users and customers off their backs from demanding features and user stories, which are usually what I call amateur design and amateur requirements by people who have no overview of everything that has to be done, no responsibility, no design ability. They're just wasting everybody's time. And by the way, you may be a hotshot coder or something, or hotshot tester, but consider elevating your talent, becoming a real software engineer, maybe a systems engineer. Here's a free book I'm going to give you on how to do that if you want. Now, in ye old days, when I was only 30 years old, I met a couple of nice guys, Michael Fagan. He visited me here in Norway, overlooking the Oslo fjord, and Ron Radis. Ron Radis also was famous for inventing the capability maturity model some of you will know about at IBM, which later went over to the Software Engineering Institute with his boss, Watts Humphrey. And anyway, they invented a thing called, let's call it IBM Inspection. And here's a book that Ron wrote about it. I've had contact with these two gentlemen the last week in connection with this lecture, so they're both alive and well, but thoroughly retired like me. Anyway, they invented inspection with the idea of collecting data to help them improve the working environment. Now, it turns out that was not successful. It was very successful at finding defects early and reducing the cost and time of doing so, but it wasn't successful in changing the working environment. Anyway, but Mike Fagan got a $100,000 prize from the CEO of IBM for the good work they did with inspection, but it wasn't what they had intended to do, which was change the working environment. So along comes Robert Mays, who I visited in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. I tried to visit his partner in crime, Carol Jones, but she's always been so shy that we don't know much about her. She's a mystical figure, can't get a photograph of her. So sorry, Carol, do try to honor you. But I still have been talking with Robert until these very days, and he wrote a chapter or two in chapter 17 in our book Software Inspection. Dorothy Graham and I wrote, and he was successful in using his defect prevention process. We're going to learn much more about it in a moment. He was successful in using this process to actually change the working environment. So, and his big trick was very simple. He delegated power to the troops, the workers, the programmers, the testers, not the managers, not the consultants, and it worked. So now defect detection, or QC, is about finding and fixing defects that get in there. Defect prevention, what Robert is doing, is avoiding them getting in there at all. People don't screw up because they've learned not to screw up or given tools to not screw up. Okay. And it turns out 10 years later, Robert got another $100,000 or so cash award from the CEO for what he did, because he not only made things less buggy, a little bit faster, a little bit cheaper, which inspection did, but he did something even better. He found a way to change and improve the organization so that people didn't screw up. And that, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Here's another old friend of mine that I've been talking with recently. This link he's doing a lot of very fun artificial intelligence all over the world, but he studied all these methods and quantified how good they were. But he did one thing I just wanted to quote here. He is called Proven Methods for Preventing Software Defects. And he's got 18. So there are 18 different methods, not just this DPP, which I think is one of these here. He doesn't call it DPP. He was at IBM in his time, and he knew exactly what was going on. If you want to talk to Capers, he's retired like the rest of us old boys, but he's still on this email if you want to contact him, and he has many a good book on the subject. Back to Robert Mays, the defect prevention process. First, it has a causal analysis meeting. You've all heard of root cause analysis and fishbone diagrams, and you remember just last week when the Starlink went down for 2.5 hours. Elon Musk promised to find the root cause and make sure it never happened again. So the root cause was some internal software stuff. So I hope they did find that. And the Starlink I'm using right now doesn't go down again. It doesn't do it very often. Anyway, and there's Dorothy Graham, my co-author of Software Inspection, and herself very much a testing expert. Our book has, again, is chapter there. Anyway, the second part is the idea of having an action team, which when the grassroots people, the people who've written the tests and written the code, identify a root cause of a frequent defect, they say, what are we going to do to prevent this? And they'll make a simple organization, a change in maybe their standards or their teaching or their tools or anything, motivation, and they'll try it out. And if it works, if it does indeed in the ensuing weeks reduce the defects coming in, they'll tell corporate, hey, spread this to all our 2,000 colleagues or whatever. And so everybody will learn to prevent defects. That's roughly the method. Here's a headline from his paper, and really the paper is the one in our book. Significant reductions in errors can be achieved with a modest investment. And here you can read the original paper from nothing like the original Robert Mays. Okay. So defect prevention process, very, very practical. It gives real process improvement. Everybody talks about process improvement. This is one of the best things I've ever seen with data showing what it costs, what it does. I'm going to give you some of that right now. It works early, frequently, measurably in all kinds of projects, whether they be aircraft projects or IT projects. Here's a typical thing that Mays reported, that in the first year of using the method, 50% of all the defects that normally happened didn't happen. And another year of sweating away and improving things, 70% didn't happen, but 30% did. Now, we don't have any data from Mays beyond this, but IBM in Minnesota reported 99.99% defect prevention using the same method, which is pretty damned good. Right after I learned about the method, I spent about 3 years working at Douglas Aircraft and Boeing, and we had used inspection on the engineering drawings, and it was very successful in finding defects. I gave you the curve from Gary a moment ago. And they said, Tom, that's very good. Can you do anything even better? I said, well, I don't know, but I just heard about this defect prevention process. And so Mac, the director, said, try it out. We've got nothing to lose. We desperately need to get a lot better, a lot faster to compete with Boeing. So I got myself 4 young engineers, and we sat us down and we said, what are we going to do to prevent the engineers from inserting defects in their engineering orders and engineering drawings? And they said, well, we get ourselves a budget of $10 to $60 million. They already had one project going at $10 million, and people I was working with were asking for $60 million to fund a big project to solve the big problem. And I said, guys, we don't have that money. Let's use the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. Why don't we try to figure something out that is so simple that you alone can do it at home for free? That's a lot cheaper than 60 million pounds. But you know what? They did it. They figured out if they had a little template with holes in it that they laid over the engineering orders and other things, they could actually prevent people from writing things. There was no hole there, so they couldn't write a defect in the wrong place in the order, that kind of thing. And they actually had about 18 or 20, 19 says here, templates. And it turns out they measurably, radically reduced the injection of defects in drawings and engineering orders, radically, like from 83 down to 3. And this was so sensational that Mac and the directors said, spread this to all 2,500 engineers. They did that within 3 months. Okay. By the way, this is actually 3 of what I talk about later called EVO, evolutionary steps. First step was we did inspection to get Gary to be motivated to inject fewer defects. And we also measured the defects. We then did a small scale template on the work of the 4 young engineers I was working with. And then the third evolutionary step, all within 3 months, the large scale plastics templates with the names of my 4 guys on it to make them famous for their 2,500 other engineers. So that was my first experience of using defect prevention. I thought, wow. Here, I mean, I don't know anything about this. I'm just sort of copying what Robert Mays said, find the root cause and, try to make it simple and all that. And it worked like a house on fire. So I earned a lot of money from Douglas Aircraft and Boeing by pulling tricks like this. So, okay, so what does it cost to do this prevention stuff? And we got 2 different numbers, but they're both small numbers. So Mays said it's 0.5% of your development cost to do the DPP. But at Raytheon, they have a number 5%. And I don't really know, they don't give me detail on, but what the heck, it's a minor cost of development, everybody says, and it gives these fantastic results in preventing defects. And here's a nice little Deming cycle thing again, where, once you find something that works better, you lock it in so that you can't roll downhill and get worse. You lock it in your standards, in your rules, as we saw, and things like that. So general assertions about the defect prevention process. It is similar in nature to the Plan, Do, Study, Act and statistical process control. It will work on any work process, but all the things associated with IT, which is hardware and legal stuff and motivation and training and everything. It's important that it works on everything because everything causes the defects. It ain't just bugs in codes. And it is I believe that defect prevention process is far more cost effective than any known form of inspection or testing. That's its track record, but then you never read about this, so you don't know about the track record, but I'm trying to tell you about it here. Now, defect prevention process is not the same as designing in qualities, like designing in security, designing usability. It is reducing the defects, which are simply violations of any standard or rule, like be clear, that you have. So, it's not the only technique we need to get qualities in the system. We need to learn how to design. But it does have a 13-to-1 return on investment, which might get the financial director interested in financing it. Okay. Here's a little diagram of in a Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle of the various sub-processes of defect prevention, which you can read about in detail in the Maze's papers. Okay. Now, I've shown you this before. This is the several years it takes. You don't plug this in and whammo, that week, everything is great. You have to keep sweating away at hundreds to thousands of changes, hundreds in a small organization and thousands in a large organization. But you gradually, prevent. Okay? Now, what you don't prevent are defects that happen. And so you could find them in testing, but you could also find them in upstream inspections and early tests and evolutionary cycle testing and things like that. Here's another look at the prevention curve, the inspection curve, and the testing curve. And here, make it a little bit more clear, is here's what you can get through prevention, which is pretty darn good. It goes all the way up to 99.99%, but it might take you 5 years to get there. In the meantime, if you've only prevented half, which is great, you can use inspection to find a lot of the other half, like 70%, but you can't find everything. So we still need to do testing. It's not obsolete yet. And you know what? Nobody's ever found a way of making software perfect against all hackers. And so users or hackers will be left to find what is not found through preventing it, getting it in, detecting it upstream and early, or testing and finding it. Okay, so here's your larger agenda. Here's some of the data from the various parts of IBM that used it early. I think the most interesting one that I'll highlight is IBM in Minnesota. In a 30-month period, they actually had 2,162 actions. These are changing their standards, their training, their motivation, whatever, so that people did not, they're curing the root cause of why certain things had a high, frequency of causal action. Okay. So what is defect prevention? Well, by now, the grassroots developers look at their own work and their own faults. They develop and try out ideas and then spread them to the larger organizations. Here's another view of defect prevention in process steps, and you can study that at your leisure. Okay, so what's happening, bottom line, with defect prevention? We're using grassroots wisdom not the wisdom of somebody who has a method they'd like to sell you or a software tool, not a manager who thinks he knows what he's doing, not outside consultants who will save you by using 5 years and $5 million or $1 billion doing nothing. Okay, these are your own people who will look at their own defects and their own working environment and change their own working environment and help to change the working environment of everybody else in their larger multinational organizations. So when will we ever learn? I'm kind of shocked that methods like this, while known and published for decades, are totally unknown by, I'm guessing, most of you. Never even heard about it and did your computer science degree and you never got a lecture on it. It's amazing how, but there are lots of other things people try to sell you and get certificates on and lots of money paid, and they don't work. But stuff that really works, that's free, why? There's nobody out there selling that for some strange reason. I guess you don't get a sales commission for free stuff that works. You do get a sales commission for bad stuff that doesn't work. Anyway, so here's Santayana, famous saying, those who cannot remember the past, and I'm accusing you and your professors of not remembering the past. You're condemned to repeat it, the bad stuff we did for years and years. Okay, here's another guy I knew personally, Pete Seeger. Where have all the flowers gone? Oh, when will they ever learn? Same thing, but it's about war. Now we turn to the EVO method. Now, the EVO method is basically an evolutionary cycle, very much like Plan, Do, Study, Act. It's just a little bit more detailed, a little bit more technical, but it's got twice the stuff in it. And I'm saying that this also is a way of, if you like, an approach to quality control and testing that is, and we don't learn it. We learn Agile. This is a form of Agile, but it's an advanced form of Agile that most people do not learn and do not do. But the core of it is this cycle, which is really a plan, do, study, act cycle. Okay. Now, EVO is effective because we're letting, again, the grassroots developers change and measure often and early. Something management doesn't get involved in these 5-year projects from the large consultancy organizations don't really get involved in. Okay. EVO is not merely a development process, but it makes use of my language or planning language, which is in this free book, Competitive Engineering. That's the standard for it. And here are some examples. We'll see larger examples of it, but here is a list of the stakeholders. They're the ones who want the quality. Here's a list of quantified values, like your security and usability. That's the value part. Then we have to do some design, which we call solutions or architecture. Those are examples there. Here we have an impact estimation table that tries to look at how effective the designs are for delivering the values. And here is decomposing large architecture ideas into smaller weekly sub-steps, which are evolutionary steps, which then deliver the value. Okay, there's developing, coding, and getting ready for testing. There's delivery, followed by testing. And the testing, hopefully, is not just looking for bugs, but it's measuring qualities like the degree of security, the degree of usability, and then it gets some disappointment, so it learns. And then this cycle is basically a weekly cycle. So that means the grassroots coders and testers and designers are all involved in it on the short-term basis. And they can, when things go wrong, they can not only change the design of the system they're building, but they can say, no, this is a problem with our own organization. You know, this is the the designers are doing bad design, and we have to cure that. Here's a larger view of it. By the way, I generated all these using Perplexity AI. So we have wonderful new tools. All the AI systems can, say, if I say, give me a list of stakeholders that are relevant to my task, they'll give me a list of values and quantify them with scales of measure. It'll do that. Give me some great design solutions to meet these. It'll do that. Give me a table and evaluate how good your strategies are. It'll do that. Decompose into small steps like weekly or even daily steps. It'll do that. So if you don't know how to do my method yet, just ask your free friend like Perplexity or ChatGPT to do it. You can even ask it, do you know Tom Gilb's methods and competitive engineering? And it will say, yes, of course I do. What do you want me to do? The EVO method has a lot of stuff in it, too much to talk about it. I asked for 40 different, unique, wonderful features and why they're wonderful. So they're listed here, but there's nothing simple. And every lecture I hold, I highlight some of it, but of course I don't have time to go through all of it. When did EVO begin? Well, in 1960, I had just left IBM after 2 years of employment and started working for my first customer or client. And we used a little electronic computer called an IBM 604 electronic calculating punch, and we programmed using plug boards. Okay. Anyway, I used my intuition to chop my project using new technology I'd never worked with and a new business type I'd never worked at. So lots of unknowns. And I said, why don't I just do one step at a time? And if it works, go for it and accumulate. If it didn't, fix it and then keep on moving towards the longer term objective, the whole system. I did it and it worked, and nobody ever told me it wasn't a success. And I kept on doing it for the rest of my life until this very day. That was 1960. 16 years later, I wrote a book called Software Metrics. You can get a free copy of it there. And I generalized my experience, and I'm quite proud of what I managed to write then. This part here in green, this is, of course, the basis for Agile, and I'm credited with it. You ought to do it in small steps. But the manifesto guys didn't pick up the idea of measuring and changing things when things screw up. That's why Agile doesn't work very well. Kept on trying to tell them, you forgot some stuff, guys. It's not just about small steps. It's about measuring what happens and learning and retreating. And yeah, Tom, well, we like your small steps. Okay. So here's the mantra. This is Agile as it should be and still can be today. But it is, in fact, an engineering idea that you measure multiple qualities simultaneously and you analyze deviation from the good and you fix things and move on. And that's not well built into any form of Agile. And then another 9 years, 1985, I'm getting very mature. I'm 45 years old at this point, and I started working when I was 18 at IBM. And I got a new Apple Mac, and I'm having a lot of fun writing diagrams of the EVO method. Okay. And a lot of people credit this as one of the earliest published papers on Agile. But of course, the 1976 book was a lot earlier, and there's earlier stuff than that. Here is the EVO method in a nutshell. In other words, I've given you a rough explanation and examples, and I'll give you more, but this is EVO in one page. It's that simple. And I'm suggesting that it is something that will radically change your testing and coding and design because it integrates them into a very small, short cycle. Okay, I'm old-fashioned. I like weekly cycles, but people at Tesla and SpaceX, they have daily 10-hour cycles where they really change real cars coming off the assembly line and make them street ready with changes, which they email through the government agencies, the changes they've made in the hardware and software. So if you think I'm crazy with 1 week cycles, talk to Elon about it. Here's another friend of mine. I once got visiting Oslo, and I used to visit him every year and talk tech with him, but I call him the Leonardo da Vinci of software engineering, Harlan Mills. And he, like Duran, understood that quality must be built into designs and cannot be inspected in or tested in. Good, okay? And here he also used another method that I talk a lot about in a book I call cost engineering, and it's called design to cost, okay? And basically you can get any cost you want. Notice I did that at Douglas Aircraft. I wanted a cost that wasn't 10 million or $60 million. I wanted something the young engineers could pay for. So I said, find something that won't cost more than you can pay out of your own pocket. And they did. That was designed to cost. It's amazing the power of this paradigm. If you're interested in why cost overrun, why time overrun, one of the reasons is that we do not teach design, and we don't teach design to cost, okay? Details in the cost engineering book. But Harlan developed a method called the clean room, which resulted in very large scale software from helicopters and spaceships, that's the space shuttle, that was delivered on time, under budget, to the high quality standards of NASA and Department of Defense. Okay, now we have forgotten that. We don't teach it. I found professors of computer science that never heard of this, let alone teach it. Damned, how stupid we are. This was published in IBM Systems Journal long ago. Every IBM customer had a free copy of that. But I even found people at IBM that didn't have time to read their own system journals, so maybe nobody else did. Now, here's the architect in Mills' clean room team, Quinnen, and he talks about design to cost, but he does something more than just design to cost up front. He does what I call dynamic design to cost, and that means every 2% EVO cycle, they're doing EVO cycles, 2%, they do 50 cycles for one very large project. I think the 2%'s in here somewhere. And what happens is, if they get a disappointment at the EVO cycle, they say, hey, Robert, you're the chief architect, you fix it, you redesign. I'll skip this for the moment. Here they are, here's their flow chart published in my my book, but they said right here on step 23, you redesign it so it's cheaper, so it has higher value. And then you measure as soon as possible that your design is working as opposed to not working. So that's agile as it should be. 50 steps, measure, bring in the designer to change the design potentially on every one of those 50 steps, as we would in an EVO cycle. These are essentially the EVO cycle, okay? Oh, you have a big complex system. This is a great way of reducing the complexity, a great way of learning from experience, because the cause and effect is more normal. Here's the book where I've published a lot of this. This was 1988, and I'm quite proud of it. You want a free copy, go ahead. I think the publisher will still send you a paper one. Here are my principles of EVO, okay? If you change in small stages, the causes of effects are clearer and easier to correct, okay? So, what have I got? Not a whole lot of time. Here's the intent was more detail on the EVO cycle, but I've been through this superficially, so I'll skim through it because I've got to save time, okay? But here's a whole book on the stakeholder thing for free, stakeholder engineering. Here's a whole book on the value requirements. Values are things like that security and usability I mentioned. You want to do requirements properly, not this silly user story stuff which is, I have a whole paper called What's Wrong with User Stories. If you're interested, look it up. Okay. Here is asking for stakeholders from Perplexity. It's rather good at giving you far better stakeholders lists than you would think of. I asked it at one point, if we covered, it's my 5-minute warning, if we covered 20 goals from 20 stakeholders instead of just 6, what happens? And the answer is your probability of survival of your system goes up to 80–85%. If you're only dealing with 6 goals, some people don't even have one clear goal, by the way, you're more or less doomed to fail. Very interesting thing here. Anyway, more of that. Here's some typical language with quantifying the objectives and whole books on how to do it, more examples of doing it, and book on design, value design, and lots of good advice from Perplexity, helping you do this kind of planning. If you don't know how to do it, let Perplexity do it for you. Principles of evolutionary measurement. It ain't as difficult as you think, and if you want to know how to do it, you'll get good advice on how to do it, again, from Perplexity. Here's a wonderful little quote. I'm glad I got time for that, from Eric Hoffer. In times of change, learners inherit the earth. What does that mean? While the learned, that's those guys with university degrees, PhD in computer science, find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. Wow, I like it. Think about that. Okay. I'm a great believer that we don't build a system for 5 years and big bang, waterfall, release it. You start with your old existing systems, no matter how bad they are, and you start evolving the increased values and the reduced cost from there week by week. I've done that all my life. It works great, but people don't even talk about it. They make the assumption they have to invest $5 million for 5 years, and then it doesn't work. So they have another 5 years and $5 million. Guess who's pocketing the $5 million? It ain't you, friend. It's your supplier who's conned you into spending a lot of money for nothing. So 3 more minutes, not too bad. Sorry, I went a little bit fast through the rest of it, but you can read about it. So what we've found is that AI is very good at helping with all this stuff. So just ask. And if you don't get a good enough answer, ask again. It's that simple. And everything I've done is free. I haven't paid for anything yet. But some of my friends and my son is paying for Grok and things like that. Grok 4, I think is good. Okay. Here's a summary. We need to deal with quality early. We need to prevent bad stuff from happening. We need to learn fast, like next week and every week for the rest of the project. And we need to do a lot of different stuff to make stuff better. Okay, and there is, again, the QR for all of these slides. These are the references. There's a whole lot of free downloads, mainly to my own books, but to plenty of other good stuff. And then we've recently been able to get some PDF copies of stuff we never had good copies of before, like this stuff. And my son is building an avatar of Tom Gilb with all of my works in it. So I will soon, as an artificial intelligence avatar, answer you from all of my books and my talks and my slides long after I'm in my grave or demented or something like that. Thank you very much, and I will certainly entertain any questions, number one, here and now. But if you're shy or you think of a question afterwards, and you email me, tom@gilb.com, on the first slide. I'll love to get your questions by email, and you will get a free, deep answer, especially if you ask a deep, good question. Turn it over to you, Linda.
Here's my contact information. If you have any questions for me, please let me know. Robin is teaching 2 classes. On August the 21st, he's going to be talking about managing a testing project. And on September the 11th, he's going to be talking about writing right user agile story acceptance testing as a workshop. Each one of those are 1 day. If you are an all access member, you can register for those at no additional cost. And here is Tom's contact information and other information from the last time. I'm hoping, Tom, that these are still up to date. And Tom's slides will also be included on our webinar page with his recording. Please be patient. It usually takes about a week to get it up there. And I have been swamped lately, so it may even take a little bit longer than that. So far, I have 2 comments and questions. The first one is from Joe, basically saying, going back to the beginning of your presentation where you mentioned language, how could applying language transform acquisition practices in federal agencies? Would implementing it require changes to existing regulations? Sorry.
Yeah, I could answer that if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I doubt it. It's typically something you can add to any existing framework. None of the frameworks for like writing contracts with suppliers forbids you from being clear. They all sort of hope you will, but they actually allow too much freedom, so we are not. So long story short, a language is a set of ideas you can, for free, without license, add with my permission in case you need it recorded right here. You can add to your existing ways of clarifying requirements and design in connection with contracting out to, for example, federal suppliers. By the way, there is a called Capability Maturity Model, CMM, which Ron Radis developed at IBM Software Engineering Institute, spread it to the government. And my methods, software metrics, were officially credited as being level 4 of Capability Maturity Model. So for decades, my methods about quantifying qualities have been used in federal acquisition in, for example, CMM.
Thank you, Tom. And we have a comment from Niles. It says that we are better not to talk about the cost of prevention, but rather how much the prevention has saved us.
Of course. But sometimes people do get worried about unknowns and costs. So you need to say, don't worry about it. Exactly what Niall said, let's focus on the advantages. By the way, the 13-to-1 return on investment is another way of putting this. Yes, it's not free, but it's 13-to-1 return on investment. What other investments do we have that are so good? Let's go for it. Talk to your chief financial officer.
Yeah, I always add to Crosby's quote, quality is free, but only if you're willing to pay for it.
Very good. I knew Phil Crosby.
Only if you're willing to pay for it onto that. It's not free, but the return on investment is so high.
Right. By the way, before I forget it, everything is good on the slide, except, of course, the slides Dropbox is for my previous lecture, not my present one. So the one that says slides, you can delete everything below that. But I gave you the QR, I gave you the link, and Linda will communicate those.
Yes, and it will also be posted out on my website. So you can get them there as well. So
if all else fails, please email me. Love to hear from people. I'm retired, and my joy is knowing that somebody cares about these great methods that we have unfortunately seemed to forget.
Yes, and Monica says, thank you very much, Tom. And I will agree with her. This has been an excellent presentation and a lot more information if you just go to the slides and read them afterwards,
Yes, as usual.
as
I
usual.
can't.
Tom always wants to give more information than is possible in an hour.
Yeah, yeah. But I did stop after an hour. Give me credit for that.
Yes. I remember attending one of your talks at a conference once, and we got through about 10% of the slides.
Yeah, yeah. I've learned how to rush through them so I get done in time.
Yes.
Forgive
Well,
me.
no, you're great, Tom. You're absolutely great. Thank you very much for talking to us today, Tom, and that's all the questions.
Okay. And I'm doing another lecture for you in the fall, right?
Yes.
So I'll see you guys later.
And Donna says, yes, this was very worthwhile.
Thank you, Donna.
And we will end the webinar for everybody. I will not see you next week. I'll see you the week after.
Bye-bye.